Hello and welcome to State of the Division. This time we bring you UFC 294. Overall, an interesting card. More notably is the Butcher's Bill for this card, but as a whole I think we have some interesting fights, at least a good main card, and we'll kind of see whether we have some contenders coming up, whether we have some new fighters that are good to be optimistic about, and see if they'll be challengers eventually. But overall, I think we can say the most interesting thing for this card is the Butcher's Bill and the new challenges that it brings. Before that, we have housekeeping. I went 8-4 in the last card, which is pretty good considering the last few weeks I've had at this. On the year, I'm 72-55. Not fully confident, but I think I can end this year at least hanging around in the positives. That being said, let's move on to what you actually care about, the Butcher's Bill. Nasruddin Imavov is out of his fight with Alisov, with Worley Alves now stepping in. In bigger news, both Oliveira and Paulo Costa are out of their respective bouts on this card. Now, Oliveira is being replaced with Alexander Volkanovski. Volkanovski being Alexander Volkanovski. I can't really describe him too much. And stepping up to face Chimaev is, in fact, Kamaru Usman, coming off his loss to Leon Edwards. Both of those are happening on about 10 days' notice. Those are the big events that happened. Let's get into the card now. Opening us off, 11-0 newcomer, Sharabuddin Bullet Magomedov looks to open strong against 23-9 Bruno Blindado Silva. Magomedov is 5 years younger, with 2 inches in height going his way with no idea on reach. Magomedov looks to be a bit of a finisher with a propensity for striking. He has 10 KO wins in his career, and look backing that up, despite the lack of stats, looks to be a solid mix of strikes and some clinch work thrown in there, with a few knee-based KOs in that. Silva is also heavy on the striking, 20 career KO wins, though he is one who relies on that power over variety or technique, with a 4.45 to 4.71 in striking. It is worth noting he has not been KO'd in his career so far, so the chin is there and it is holding. Does only have a .56 takedown average, so staying on the feet is where he wants to be, and with a 73% takedown average, he's pretty good at staying there. Vegas likes Magomedov, and I'm going to agree. Silva has not been all that hot in the UFC, and while he hasn't been knocked out, he has a tendency to just wade into fire and get hit, which I think can result in him being decisioned in this case, given that Magomedov seems to be able to move around more and has more variety and can likely get to the end of the fight. 7-0. Victoria Dudakova looks to keep her 0 against 11-9 Jin Yufrey. Dudakova is 14 years younger, somewhere between 2 to 4 inches in height, also going her way, in addition to a definite 2 in reach. Dudakova has a very small UFC sample size, but as a generalization, she's very much a ground-focused fighter with the ability to control her opponents and limit their ability to produce offense. And with 4 submission wins in there, you have that constant threat of the fight ending if you make a mistake or get even the slightest bit out of position. I don't know about her striking, but at the worst, it's good enough to hang in there. Jin Yufrey is honestly very similar, more so a grinder over the submission ability though. An overall focus on control and limiting the ability of her opponents. I will say she does tend to strike more, but the effectiveness of it is very, very, very questionable. She was outstruck in her last 4 fights. In addition, her takedowns are a little inconsistent, with stretches where she cannot land one. Vegas likes Dudakova by far, and I'm also going to agree. Yufrey has been cold so far and really hasn't been able to stand out in any aspect. Dudakova has shown an ability to both strike and grapple in addition to power, and of course one of those fights was the Contender Series, but it's still more than I've seen out of Yufrey, and in the end that's going to make me go with Dudakova. 19-5, Nathaniel the Prospect Wood takes on 9-2 Muhammadjan Hilman Naimov. 1 year of age for Naimov, though he does take 3 inches in height and a whopping inch in reach. Wood is a solid fighter who is able to use both sides of the game pretty well. Recently he has been leaning on the striking a little more with a 6.24 to 4.35 in the stats. I will say he hasn't had the KO or finishing touch as of recently. His last finish was submission in 2018, but he has been able to match up well with other strikers. His ground game also serves as a great tool where he'll pour it on against fighters with lesser ground defense and use it sparingly in others. Rocks a 1.70 average with takedowns and a 76% takedown defense. So you can see he does a solid job avoided going down. Naimov is another fighter with a small sample size, a running theme on this card, but he seems to be a pretty rounded fighter as well. 5 career KO wins, 2 submission, 2 decision. Striking seems pretty varied and can call on power when needed, not always the standard of his game. I'm curious about, as in neither of his 2 UFC fights did he have one, so maybe a game plan decision or something else that he's moving away from as of late. Vegas likes Wood, but this time I have to pause. Statistically, Wood definitely looks to be the better overall fighter. But Naimov has that finishability lurking in the wings, so in the end, I am going to take a gamble here and roll with Naimov. I think Wood has a good chance, but if his ground control is shut down or nullified, he can be beat. Naimov has overcome a similar thing. He overcame 3 takedowns, keeping it to about 3 minutes of ground control against Jamie Malarkey. So I think this game will be somewhat similar to that, with Naimov having to overcome or nullify a majority of Wood's ground game, and then his striking, which I think he has more power than Wood does, will go his way. Obviously, I think it's a bit of a reach here, but the way Naimov fights makes me lean his way a little more. Ending off the interesting early prelims. 10-5, Mike Money Breeden looks to get a UFC win against 7-0 Anshul, King of Lions, Jubil. I'm sorry if I said any of that wrong. Jubil is 6 years younger, 2 inches in height, going his way, though Breeden does take back 1 inch in reach. Breeden has not had a good UFC run so far. Numbers-wise, he has a 5.22 to 7.02 in striking, and in the UFC, has only led in striking for 1 fight, that he lost. His biggest issue with the striking seems to be getting caught, as 2 of his 4 fights ended in KO. He does have a 1.37 takedown average, but in his 3 takedown performance, he was taken down 9 times as well. Jubil is more so a grinder, with only 3 career finishes, 2 KO, 1 submission, and 4 decision wins. Striking is definitely a strength, but his ability to mix in takedowns when needed to slow down and take control or disrupt his opponent. Another low stat one, Vegas is taking Jubil, and I'm going to roll with it. Breeden has not impressed me too much, and I don't really know what to do here, so I'm going to take Vegas's cop-out. I'm going to roll with the Vegas pick. I'm going to roll with Jubil. On to the prelims. 14-3-1. Abu, Captain Morocco Azatar, looks for the rebound against 8-1. Cedric, the Reaper, Dumas. Dumas is 9 years younger, 6 or 5 inches taller, with 3 inches in reach, rolling his way. Azatar is yet another fighter with a small sample size, but as a whole, he reads as a striker with a 5.21 to 5.35 and 7 career KO wins. The power to finish is definitely there. However, his next highest win amount is 6 decisions, so if he doesn't get the knockout, he's not completely sunk. He does also have a submission win, but that happened in 2011, so I have no idea how involved in this fight or future fights that will be. Dumas is more so a finisher with 4 career KO wins and some solid striking. In the UFC, he has also had some great ground control performances in some recent fights. Against Cody Brundage, he was taken down twice, but off those he managed to rack up 11 minutes of ground control and held the striking lead. It was 17-3, but he held the striking lead. Vegas goes to Dumas here, and overall this feels very much like a toss-up. I feel both fighters have the tendency to finish. Both fighters have the ability to finish. Azatar has a slight more versatility, but I think the ground game of Dumas sets him apart here, and the more so submission ability and the 40% takedown defense that Azatar has make me think that this will go his way. 14-0, Havid Snow Leopard Basharat looks to stay perfect against 23-6. Victor La Mangosta Henry. Basharat is 8 years younger, either even or 2 inches in height going his way, with only an inch of reach separating the two. Basharat is a well-rounded fighter who has really utilized both aspects to control his opponents and really restrict their overall abilities. In striking, he rolls with a 5.64 to 2.30 and the consistent ability to take and hold the striking lead. And while he does have some KO ability, his last one was in 2018. His ground game has been really consistent with a 2.03 average and solid takedown defense, letting him control when he goes to the ground in most cases. He does also have submission ability, but hasn't locked one in since his Contender Series fight. Henry only has 3 UFC fights, but he's very much looked like the wild child. I mean, an 8.67 to 5.98 in striking with 0 takedowns tells you all you need to know about that. Of course, as I say that, he does have 8 career KO and submission wins, but based on the UFC numbers, he seems to be all in on the striking as of late. Now, Vegas loves Basharat, and I'm going to be boring and agree. I think Basharat's consistency and some slight variety is a little better than the wild child we've seen from Henry so far. I think Henry's going to struggle with getting taken down, being that he's been taken down at least once in each of his UFC fights. And while I think he might be able to survive and recover, I think giving Basharat a round or giving Basharat any leverage is going to overall work against you in this fight. 12-3, Muhammad, the UAE Warrior, Yaha looks to debut with a win against 8-1-0-1, that's weird to say, Trevor Peek. Peek is a year younger, even height across the board, and absolutely no clue on reach, but I can tell you Peak has a 70-inch reach. Yaha is a finisher with deferent preference for the striking, 7 career KO wins in that regard. He seems to be a bit of a boxer, with the majority of his finishes being with punches, although that's pretty vague for MMA. He does have a submission game, but they are relatively infrequent compared to the striking-based finishes. He has been KO'd once and submitted twice, but overall is great at avoiding ending up in dangerous positions. Peak is also a finisher with 8 career KO wins. In the UFC, he carries a 5'6" to 5'18" striking, and really pushes pace while being able to pull power when needed. He can shoot a takedown, but it seems infrequent and more so recovery or game plan over consistent aspect of his game. The narrow favorite is Peak, and I'm going to disagree. This is mostly hedging my bets, but I feel that Yaha, who is a boxer by trade, has a bit more MMA experience and has looked decent in those fights, is going to be able to come in and against another striker like Peak, he's going to be able to kind of work his style, avoid a lot of damage, and be able to outpace Peak in a way, or at least match Peak where he is, and possibly call on other aspects of his game that we haven't really seen Peak use all that much. Ending off these prelims, 19-12-1, Tim Elliott looks to take his streak to 3 against 10-0-0-1, Muhammad the Punisher Mokaev. Mokaev is 13 years younger, either 2 inches taller or the same height as Elliott, but definitely takes 4 inches in reach over Elliott. Elliott is good, and I'm hard-pressed to find a better adjective. He's a decently rounded fighter with a 3.47 and a 2.76, and seems to live with being good enough to hang in with anyone he fights, especially since he doesn't really have any real KO power. What he does have is this consistent and stackable takedown game. Numbers-wise, it's a 3.8 average. But the real danger is with how he can stack them against his opponents. Now, it can be turned against him, but that does require someone to surpass his skill on the ground, which I have to admit is pretty solid. Mokaev is much more of a finisher compared to the grinding control style of Elliott. He rolls with a 1.14 to 0.87 in striking, which really tells you where he wants this fight to go. And in that regard, he has a 7.34 takedown average and 5 career submission wins. He's not necessarily a quick starter, with his last 3 fights going to the third, with 2 of those being finishes. Now, Vegas likes Mokaev, and I'm hard-pressed to pick against it. Elliott isn't a bad fighter. The issue is that he's also doesn't look to be a great fighter. And he looks to be either a little under or about the same as Mokaev. And I think Mokaev's dangerous ground game and submission ability is something that Elliott's going to have to face head on. And I'm not sure Elliott can overcome it, because I don't think Elliott's good enough on the feet to beat Mokaev or stay off the ground. I don't think his ground game alone, the control style, is going to keep him in that octagon longer and give Mokaev more chances to get the finish, which overall I think tilts a lot in the favor of Mokaev. So in the end, that's why I'm going with Mokaev. Kicking off this main card, 17-3, Saeed Nurmagomedov looks for a quick rebound against 18-5, Muin Tajik Gafarov. I'm so sorry. Gafarov is 4 years younger, but Nurmagomedov is a whopping 1 inch taller, with another 2 inches in reach going his way. Nurmagomedov is a remarkably solid and consistent fighter. He ranks a 3.54 to 2.15 in striking, and while I wouldn't call him a KO artist, the ability is there, though his last one was in 2020. But as I said, it's more so the consistent striking, where it doesn't light up the numbers, but it's concise, accurate, and sets up an overall game. In that same vein, racks a 1.03 takedown average with a run of submissions recently, 2 in his last 3. Doesn't always need the takedown to get that submission either, which adds to the double threat nature of his game. Gafarov is a relative newcomer with 1 actual fight loss and a contender series loss, but outside the UFC, he's been a finisher with 10 KO and 7 submission wins. He has been really good so far at avoiding the finish, only losing by decision this far into his career. Narrow favorite is Nurmagomedov, and while I have questions about some parts of his game going forward, Gafarov has not impressed me in the UFC at all. He has good numbers outside, but every time we step up to the UFC, we see him stumble, we see him slow down, and Nurmagomedov's at least risen to the challenge. So I'm going to pick Nurmagomedov. I think his consistent striking is great. I think his ability when needed to take down and control is great. I just don't think Gafarov's going to be able to match that or surpass that in any way. The first of the replacement fighters, 14-6, Warley Alves, takes on 14-1, Ikram Alisov. Alisov is 2 years younger, 1 inch taller, with 4 inches in reach, also going his way. Alves is coming in short notice off 2 losses, and while that isn't a nice thing to say, I think it is important to note. Stylistically, I think he can best be called a killer-be-killed finisher, with the majority of his wins coming by that finish. Numbers-wise, rolls with a 3.21 to 4.09, which isn't too surprising, given that killer-be-killed style. He does have some decent strike variety, but he has been caught in exchanges before. Takedown-wise, rocks a 1.37, but we see it more so in his losses, so it feels like recovery or desperation over a consistent part of his game. Alisov is another fighter with a small sample size, but as a whole, I'd call him a finisher. 5 KO, 5 submission wins. In his 2 UFC fights, the striking was a little weird, with a narrow lead in his actual fight that he won by KO, but lost in strikes badly to his Contender Series match that he won with a Kimura. So we see him kind of leaning on the parts of the game that either is going more his way that fight, or something his opponent is weaker in. Alisov is the hard favorite here. And I will agree. I'm hard-pressed to pick against him here. And while I think that Alves could pull something out, he's kill or be killed, Alisov can take down and go to the ground and control and submit. Alisov has stood on the feet with other fighters and gone at them. And I think unless Alves gets his shot, gets his moment, and pulls off that KO, I think Alisov is the fighter who is overall better at this moment. I think I'm going to pick him to win. 17-1-1. Magomed Ankalaev looks to come back from his draw with a win over 21-7 Johnny Walker. Both fighters are 31. Walker is either 2 or 3 taller, with 7 in reach, also going to Walker. Ankalaev is best described as a controlling type of striker, but that'll mean he will outstrike his opponents, but not by an absurd amount. Instead, you see him take control of their offense, deal consistent damage throughout 3 rounds. In regards to striking, he has a 3.55 to 2.15, which backs that up, I feel, and does speak to the narrow margins that he'll take over. Behind this all is a disruptive 0.99 takedown average, and while it is consistent, he often doesn't get large chunks of control time with it, oftentimes simply disrupting his opponent and taking a round or a chunk of the round while he recovers to put pressure on. Walker is a very different fighter, more of a finisher in comparison. He has similar numbers in the striking with a 3.85 to 2.58, but much more consistent power that he's able to bring out. Obviously, and then he does have to exchange, and as a result can be caught and has been put away at times. His ground game is much more recovery and just moment by moment disruption over a true threat and a consistent game plan aspect, with a 0.51 takedown average. He can be aggressive with the submission attempts, but that's more of an opportunistic thing over a consistent threat, at least I feel. Vegas goes with Ankalaev, and I will agree. Walker has a shot. Most KO artists have to have a shot, but it's a longer shot than I want to run with. Ankalaev is very good at managing the striking. He's very good at controlling, avoiding, taking the shots given to him. Walker's a little more wild, willing to throw wild things, willing to throw the elbow, throw the punch, throw the kick, throw the knee, etc., etc., etc. But I think doing that against Ankalaev leaves you more open for him to counter, and I think that's going to work against Walker in the long run. Obviously, if he lands it, it can go his way in a heartbeat, but he has to land it, and I think that's where the issue comes in. Now, for the co-main event. Late replacement, 20-3, Kamara, the Nigerian Nightmare Usman, looks to hand a 1 to 12-0 Khamzat Boris Chimaev. Chimaev is 7 years younger, 2 inches taller, does surrender a whopping inch in reach. Usman is still a monster, even without championship gold, and really excels in both sides of the game. With striking, he has both rocked the technical style, where he controlled his opponent's options and pieced them up on the feet, while also having fights where he brought out his power to put them away. As such, he rocks a 4.46 to 2.75 in that striking, and I feel really resents how he can flip the switch and flip his style depending on what's needed. In that same vein, his 2.96 takedown average helps him dictate tempo or even just rack up control time, though that one's a little less common. Chimaev, best way to describe him, he's been a dominator in all but one of his fights, and even then, he brought the thunder in that fight. As such, his numbers are a little preposterous, with a 7.30 to 3.98 in striking with a 3.98 takedown average. All that being said, he's a very talented wrestler and grappler, taking opponents down with his power. And on the feet, I feel that he gets a little wild at times, but with how hard he can hit, he's been able to put opponents away the most of the time. And the few times he didn't, he still was able to rock them and hurt them, looking at that Gilbert Burns fight. And all that being said, he has finished all but one of his UFC fights and seems to be able to do it on the feet or on the ground. Obviously, the power is a big part of his game, and it's hard to match his power in that regard. So when somebody survives that, it got a little hairy last time against Burns, but he was able to overcome that to win. Chimaev is the favorite here, and I'm honestly torn. I think Usman still has a lot left, even despite the 2 losses he had. I think he's still an amazing wrestler. I think his striking is solid. I think when he puts those together, he can beat most fighters. The issue is that we have him facing another very good wrestler who is 7 years younger, is very powerful. And quite frankly, I'm realizing now I shouldn't have not written this part of the script and actually wrote my decision down so I didn't have to think of it now. I think I'm going to run with the hype train and pick Chimaev. I think Usman has a chance, but Usman has to do a lot more work on 10 days' notice against a very big, very strong, very powerful fighter in Chimaev, who has been able to match other very good wrestlers in this division. So in the end, I'm going to pick Chimaev based on both his age, the fight he had with Burns, and how he was able to handle Burns' takedowns, and the expectation that 10 days might not be a full amount for Usman to get to his tip-top shape. For the main event, 24-1, Islam Makhachev will no longer rematch Oliveira. Instead, he's taking on, yet again, 26-2, Alexander the Great Volkanovski. Makhachev is 4 years younger, 4 inches taller, but somehow gives up an inch of reach, and I want someone to explain that to me, because that's honestly confusing. Now, most of what I said about Makhachev last time still stands, though some numbers have changed. He has a 2.35 landed, 1.97 absorbed, and a takedown average of 3.24. It's that very technical blend of striking where he doesn't really push the quantity too much and relies on openings and opportunity. He does help create those with a ground game that you have to pay attention to, based around control more so, but submissions can get mixed in if it lines up correctly. As a whole, he still very much slows the fights down to his pace and does rely on controlling the fight's pace for most of his success. Of course, he's very good at that. I will say there were times when he looked surprised or uncomfortable in the Volkanovski fight, not out of his depth or anything, but surprised he wasn't able to control Volk in the way or style that he wanted to. Volk has also very much cemented his place in 145 lore with a win over Yair Rodriguez, but once again, I don't feel like there's a whole lot new to say. Obviously, he could have a very different game plan, and Makhachev has to adjust quickly to a new opponent. Numbers-wise, he's still solid with a 6.25 to 3.36 in striking, and while he can get KO TKOs, it always feels more like a quantity over power shot thing in that regard. All this is backed up by 1.86 takedown average that he can stack or get control time off of if needed. As a whole, he's still best described as a chameleon who adjusts how he fights based on his opponent, changing up his game plan, his style, and what to expect in that regard to give him the best chance to win. Vegas likes Makhachev, and I'm hard-pressed to disagree here. I think Volk is great, and I think Volk will go down as one of the all-time greats. I just think 10 days' notice to go up a weight class to someone who seems to be very natural at this weight class, somebody who's very good at slowing the fights down, controlling their opponents on the ground, I feel like that all goes towards Makhachev and isn't a plus in Volk's favor. It's more Volk has to overcome on short notice, relatively close to his last fight. So in the end, I think I am going to pick Makhachev. I would like Volk to win. I'm very much a Volk fanboy, but I think Makhachev, as it stands now, has the skills that are hard counters to what Volk wants to do. And I think unless Volk brings in a monstrous game plan and attacks us at a completely new angle, I think this goes Makhachev's way. I don't imagine it being the exact same as the first fight, but I wouldn't be surprised if it turns into a similar affair. But overall, that's UFC 294. Go ahead and leave your opinions in the comments, whether I'm right or wrong, or whether you completely disagree with my analysis on somebody. Go ahead, like, subscribe if you wish. That being said, thank you for watching. This has been State of the Division. See you next fight.